everybody. I'm Annemarie Ahearn. Thank you for that introduction. I wanted to share with you first that my foray into the food world was actually in New York City, and I was an intern at Slow Food when they still had headquarters in Manhattan, and then they eventually moved to Dumbo. I'm not even sure where they are now, but it was a wonderful job to have as a young 20-something in New York. I was simultaneously fact-checking for Silver Magazine. And yeah, it's when I realized I needed to go to culinary school. So thank you, Slow Food, for giving me a good start. So today we are in my kitchen, which is in Lincolnville, Maine. Lincolnville is about about an hour and a half north of Portland, if you haven't been here before. And we're gonna cook one of the dishes from my cookbook, which is called Modern Country Cooking, and I'll show you guys the cover real quick. Here we are. This is the second book that I've done with Roost Books. And the first one was called Full Moon Suppers at Saltwater Farm, which was based on the supper club that we did for over 10 years. And we teach a lot of cooking classes here. We teach about 80 classes from April until the end of October, beginning of November. And they range in subject. We teach lots of stuff on kitchen fundamentals. Things like bread baking, cheese making, pie dough, soups, salads, all kinds of stuff. And then we also teach regional cuisine courses, things, we focus on different regions of France, Italy, Spain, and Mexico, which are all places I've spent time and just have a real fondness for. So those are some of our offerings. We also teach classes in honor of female cooks who have passed away. Such as Julia Child, Marcella Hazan, Edna Lewis. And we now teach a class called Modern Country Cooking, which is focused on this book. And the book is really sort of the product of 10 years of work here at Saltwater Farm. The mission at Saltwater Farm is to get people to cook more instinctively, more resourcefully, and to sort of step away from the recipe, put it down, trust their instincts. And we tell people, and now is actually, it's more sort of relevant than ever. If you don't have everything, it's okay, because you can always make a dish with substitutes. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But yeah, so today's recipe is a very simple salad. It is hardly spring in Maine. It is still feels like winter on some days, but the asparagus are just starting to sort of peek through the chilly earth, and the chives have come up. They're always the first herb to come up. And I just checked this morning, and we have lovage and sorrel, which are wonderful herbs. Sorrel is really lemony, and lovage is sort of like has a celery flavor to it. So we use those a lot in soups and stuffing fish and stocks and things of that nature. But we are lucky here. We have a beautiful glass greenhouse, which I hope I can show you guys later. And it is filled with seedlings. So we have lots of microgreens and sprouts and things to make salads with. So this time of year, we do a lot of green cooking because it is like the celebration of the very first green things that are popping out of the ground. And so this dish really is a celebration of literally every single thing that we have available to us right now, which is very little, but makes it that much more special. So let's see, I'm going to open the recipe. As I mentioned earlier, I write recipes for a living, but when I cook, I don't really use them, but you guys will probably use these recipes. So let me just get open to that page. Okay, so the first thing that I did, and I did this ahead of time because this is television, sort of, but I decided to cook the farro. And farro is a hearty grain. I always encourage people to keep a few alternative grains in your cupboard. And when you sort of like have that impulse to reach for a box of pasta, squash it and think, what could I make that would maybe sit better in my stomach and is better for me? So there's a whole bunch of different alternative grains, barley, spelt, wheatberry, farro. There's more. If you go to a health or whole food store in the bulk aisle, you'll see lots of different alternative grains. And the benefit of these is that they're not as processed. They have more nutritional value, and they kind of sit heavier in your stomach, meaning you don't need nearly as many. So they fill you up quickly. So I use farro a lot. I really love farro, and some people like to cook it longer than other people. Some people like it soft. Some people like it to have like a little bit of not bite, but like resistance to it. So the one really important thing is that you salt your water well, because otherwise you're not going to taste the inherent flavor of whatever grain you're using. So over here we have a whole bunch of farro that I've already cooked, and I haven't salted the water yet, so I'm going to do that. Let's just talk about seasoning. You guys can see me? Yeah? Okay. Let's just talk about seasoning for a second. So I always have a pot of kosher salt hanging around, many of them actually, in the kitchen. And when you're seasoning things, you really want to bring out as much flavor as possible. So I always say it's like a pinch per person, not a pinch for the entire pot of whatever you're making. So a really big pinch to season all of this, maybe a pinch and a half, to season all of this farro. And you want to make sure that it cooks for a little while with that salt, so that it sort of penetrates the grain and tastes delicious. And after you strain it, let me just give this a little stir. After you strain it, you're going to coat it with a little bit of olive oil. The reason that you do that is because, sort of like pasta or any grain, it has a tendency to sort of stick and clump. So the olive oil just loosens things up. And whenever I'm cooking a big meal and I've made grains and I cook them ahead of time, one of the great things about farro is you can cook it first thing in the day and serve it for dinner, and it can sit out all day. It stands up over time. But you do want to give it a little stir, every half hour, just to make sure that it's loose and it hasn't sort of clumped together. So real quick, I'm going to strain this over in the sink. Try to get as much water out of it as you can. We'll take a nice bowl. And the recipe calls for 1 cup. Of course, if you want to make this with leftovers and for the week, you could double the recipe. The one thing I'll say is you can dress it the day of. You'll probably want a little more dressing the next day or the day after that. But I wouldn't add the greens until you're ready to assemble the salad. So, all right, we've got our farro cooked. Really beautiful color. I don't know if you guys can see this, but it's got a nice hue to it. And it's nicely salted and flavored and done. So we can move on to the next step. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is cook some asparagus. So I cook just about everything in cast iron. This is a 12-inch skillet made by Lodge, and we talk a lot about conditioning cast iron here at Saltwater Farm. A lot of people are intimidated by it because they don't know how to properly care for it. And the trick with cast iron is that every single time you use it, you want to get out all of the grit and grime, and the way to do that is with a little kosher salt and some neutral cooking oil, or just any oil is fine. Olive oil is all right. And I take a paper towel and rub the salt with the oil into the grit and grime until the surface is smooth. The salt helps to sort of break up the whatever's on the pan while simultaneously being conditioned by the oil. And then I'll wipe out the salt, just rinse the whole thing under water really quickly, and then cure it by putting it on the over an open flame until it's like screaming hot, like almost smoking, and then it's ready for the next use. The thing you can't do with cast iron is let it dry on your drying rack, because there's residual water which becomes rust and it shortens the life of your cast iron. So just make sure you're sort of following that little tip, and you guys will have cast iron for a long, long time. All right, so we're going to get this nice and hot and add a little bit of olive oil to it. And the next thing we're going to do is cut our asparagus. So here we have asparagus. I wish I could say this was from the farm, but our asparagus, there's about that much of a reveal right now. Just the little heads are are sticking out of the ground. And normally in the summertime, they would grow like 2 or 3 inches a day. I always say that you can actually like watch asparagus grow. It's incredible, but it's so cold. I mean, it's so cold. Like I just went outside and it's a beautiful day, but it feels like it's 25 degrees outside. Anyways, there's not enough warmth for the asparagus to reach up towards the sky quite yet. So anyways, these are not from the farm, but soon we will have more asparagus than we know what to do with. But whenever you're buying asparagus, you want to make sure that you're using the tenderest part. And so when you snap them, there's a natural point at which they are tender and they're not tender. And you can't always tell by looking at them, so the snap test is a really effective one. So you just go through your asparagus and snap each of them. And that'll sort of just tell you which part to discard. Some people I've noticed will, particularly on fat asparagus, will shave the bottom part of them, which makes sense. It sort of takes the tougher skin off of it. But with skinny guys like this, you don't need to. And when we harvest them from the garden, there is no tough part. The whole thing is tender. You can eat them raw. They're just so delicious. If you have any amount of land, asparagus are an awesome, awesome investment. All right. So we'll go heavy on the asparagus for this because we've got them. All right, so the olive oil is starting to have a nice hot sheen to it. And what we're going to do is basically grill the asparagus in a cast iron pan. So the key here is you don't want to overcrowd the pan. If you do, they'll steam. And what we want to do is get some nice color on them really quickly. So if your pan is smoking, that's a good thing. People are oftentimes afraid to use high heat at home, but you can always tell the difference between a home cook and a professional chef by the amount of heat that they use. The professional chefs, they cook everything really fast, really hot. All right, so let's take these asparagus. And for this recipe, you want, since it's a salad, everything needs to fit on a fork or a spoon. So like a 1 inch, 1.5 inch cut is good. Like that. And we'll put these in the pan. We just want really just one layer here, maybe a couple more. And then we'll shake it out like this. Get a set of tongs. You know, you should always have a set of tongs handy because tongs are like an extension of the hand. This is another tip you learn in cooking school. A lot of home cooks use spoons or something to move things around, but a tong is so much more useful. It gives you so much more control over what you're doing. So, all right, and while these are in the pan, I'm going to salt them. We're going to use kosher salt, like this. Nice flavor. You get somewhere to put them when they come out. You want like a big flat surface, something like this, so that they don't steam when they come out, but rather they can sort of cool quickly. All right, so we'll let those go. In the meantime, we will cut the rest of our asparagus. Get those ready. All right, so we've got the farros in the bowl, the asparagus is cooking. That is pretty much the extent of the hot cooking that goes into this recipe. The rest of it is a salad dressing, and I stumbled upon the salad dressing maybe 2 years ago, and I was missing a bunch of ingredients, but it called for buttermilk. I can't remember where I found the recipe. And I threw in a bunch of spring herbs from the farm, and I didn't have it called for yogurt, but I didn't have yogurt, so I used creme fraiche. I used whatever I had, and it was like just the tastiest dressing ever. And it's not just the kind of dressing you want to put on the lettuce. It's like the kind of dressing you want to put on so many other things. So we're gonna make this dressing, and I'm actually using yogurt today because I don't have creme fraiche. So any sort of sour dairy product is good. This is from Milk House Yogurt, which is an awesome dairy farm run by some friends of mine in the state of Maine. We're using a lot of Maine products. Kate's buttermilk. Kate also makes butter, and we use tons of it. I always say that I should get a Kate sponsorship here at Saltwater Farm. Haven't actually made the call yet, but all right. And then we're also going to use garlic, and I really want to talk about garlic for a second. So we're going to move these around, but like just once or twice, because the minute you start moving things constantly, they start to steam. I'm always like my husband is always moving things around constantly. I'm always telling him to leave it alone. He's a great cook. He's a great cook, but yeah, just leave it alone. It's the same concept as grilling. Once you put something down on the grill, you want to let it do its thing, form a crust, start to cook within, flip it one time, let it finish cooking, and call it a day. So these are really close to done. When you take something out of a pan, consider the fact that it will continue cooking. So I am guessing, I'm going to taste one of these. These are pretty skinny, which means they're going to cook quick. It needs like 15, 20 seconds, and then those can all come out of the pan, and we'll do round two. But you don't want to overcook these. You want them to still have some firmness to them in the salad. All right, so I'm going to give these a shake, put them onto the pan, spread them out so they cool. All right, a little more olive oil. We'll let it get hot before we put the asparagus in the pan. An empty pan over high heat will burn very, very quickly. If you're ever just leaving a pan over high heat and walking away from the stove, you're making a mistake. You always have to have something in the pan. We'll give it a shake to flatten it out. We'll give it a little bit of salt. Okay, so we're gonna let those go. And okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about is garlic. So here we have some nice hearty garlic. And most of our salad dressings at Saltwater Farm are made in a mortar and pestle. We use a variety called Milton Brook. It's made in England. It is really solid, really smooth surface, never breaks, and just gets the job done. It's awesome. I'll show it to you. Hold on. So people are always saying, like, why are the salad dressings you make so good? It's because of this. It's because we grind garlic into a paste with some salt, and then we rub it around the inside of the mortar. And the garlic, as in a paste form, infuses the dressing in a way that just chopped garlic doesn't. You can use a blender as well. The one thing I have to say, with every single recipe that calls for garlic in a sauce or something that's sort of liquid, you need to put the garlic in the blender first and alone and let it get really, really chopped up. Because if you throw a clove of garlic into a blender that has vinegar and oil in it, it's going to get chopped up into like 10 pieces. But if you put it in by itself, it's going to get chopped up into like 100 pieces. And because garlic is so strong and flavorful, that's a big difference in flavor. Okay, so we've got a clove of garlic. Following my own recipe here. Oh, 2 cloves of garlic. So this is a pretty huge clove. I don't know, this is like, what's the trick to getting garlic out of the skin? Just smash the hell out of it, and then it'll come right out. If garlic has this little green thing inside, you do want to get rid of that. It's not awesome to digest. All right, our asparagus is done, so let me just move that so we can be done with the burners. And again, we're going to spread that out so that it stops cooking as quickly as possible. Okay, great. So usually when we make a salad dressing, we put the garlic in the mortar and pestle and we pound up and down until the garlic becomes like a paste. We're going to use the blender today, and the reason we're using a blender is because we're using a lot of fresh herbs. You can mince fresh herbs in the traditional way of like making a pesto is to do this in a mortar and pestle. But I have to say a blender is really helpful when you're trying to make a smooth, creamy, green, goddess-like dressing. So we're going to use the blender today, okay? So we've got our garlic. This is a huge clove, so I'm just going to use 1 clove instead of 2. Always use your best judgment when it comes to such things. I'm going to put in a pinch of salt with the garlic. That's it. And we're going to let that get ground up. Look at that. And I see like a little chunk that is lost its way here. I want it to get blended before we move forward. Okay, I know it seems like a small thing, but it really completely changes the flavor of a dressing if your garlic is cut into a million pieces versus not, okay? So we're gonna compost food scraps because that's what we do, and because it's Earth Day, everybody should compost if they can. All right. And the next thing that we're going to do is start building the dressing. So we've got the garlic. Next thing we're going to do is add some buttermilk, which I have right here. This is 1 cup of Kate's buttermilk. And then it calls for 2 tablespoons of creme fraiche. We're going to use this Milk House yogurt, which I'm just giving a little mix to get it even. This is what we have for breakfast every morning. Creme fraiche or yogurt, really that little extra creaminess makes the texture of the dressing really great. So I don't want to skip that. Next up is zest and juice of a lemon, and I don't think I've ever written a recipe that doesn't call for the zest. I figure if you're using the juice, you might as well use the zest. It just adds tons of flavor. Make sure you have a nice sharp zester, and when you're zesting, here's a little trick. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't. Hold the zester up so you can catch the zest like this, and then just turn it over and tap it into wherever it's going. When you zest like this, it kind of gets all over the countertop. So, and you also only really want to get that top layer of the lemon skin, because that's where all of the flavor and the oils of the lemon sort of reside. The minute you get to the pith, it's bitter, and that will also actually change the flavor of your dressing if you get the pith in there. My grandmother used to eat a whole grapefruit, pith and all, and she swore it was what made her live so long. It was hard to watch. Do you remember that? Yeah. All right, so we've got zest of a huge lemon here. Lemons just keep getting bigger and bigger. All right, we'll cut into this. And I would say, like, if lemon is something you don't love as much as I do, you had one small lemon, that would be fine. But if you have a really big lemon, use the whole thing, because I think it's part of what makes this dressing so delicious. So we've got lemon juice, that in there. And then we've got the parsley and tarragon and chive. So let me just clean up my board real quick so I can do some chopping. Okay, so here we have some tarragon. So I will take some of the, I think it calls for 8 stems, 6 sprigs tarragon. And this is another thing that's like, you know, some sprigs are bigger than other sprigs. Some are really small and puny. So it's a function of how much. Tarragon is a strong flavor, but I would argue that it is maybe the most important ingredient in this dressing, because it sort of defines the direction of the herb profile. So I really love tarragon, and it makes me think so much of this time of year. We make a lot of dishes. It's actually one of my favorite dishes, which is so simple, is making asparagus just like we did, and throwing in some of these tarragon leaves at the very end so they just barely wilt. And then I'll put a poached egg on top of that and eat it for breakfast. It's delicious and super simple.
Annemarie, can you talk a little bit about the difference in flavor between cooking asparagus or per se anything else on a cast iron pan, versus someone has asked about a normal pan, but we'll call that maybe a stainless steel pan or a material other than cast iron?
I mean, I really do think it tastes different, and the difference is really, it feels like the difference between, to me, in terms of flavor, grilling and just sautéing something on a high heat. You know, some people also say there's benefits to cooking with iron for people that are iron deficient. So there's a lot of pluses to cooking with cast iron. It also distributes heat in a way that's really even. And we cook a lot of eggs in cast iron, despite what many people think. If you have a well cared for cast iron, the eggs don't stick. Here comes Dad. And so, yeah, it's my go-to device for cooking always. And I just think it produces better tasting, more beautiful food. And because I'm used to using cast iron, I find the results like pretty dependable. Yeah. Okay, we got plenty of tarragon in there. We're gonna put these chives in. These are from the garden outside. They're still pretty small. So knife skills 101 real quick. When you're holding a knife, you wanna hold the handle like this. And I hold the blade with my index finger on one side and my thumb on the other. And you wanna do sort of like a rocking motion as opposed to just chopping. A lot of home cooks, they lift their knife up and down and they dull the center of the blade. Meanwhile, the top and the bottom are quite sharp. But professional chefs will rock the blade and use the length of the blade, which is how knives are intended to be used. So you'll see that rocking motion here. I'm just sort of moving my fingers back slowly as I get closer and closer. And I find with herbs, even though they're going in a blender, unless you have like a master Vitamix, it really is worth just giving them a good chop before they go in, because otherwise the blender has to work really hard. Some blenders don't like that. And then the last thing we're going to do is put in some parsley. Usually I use flat leaf, but guess what? They didn't have it. So we're using curly parsley, which is totally fine in this dressing. It's fine all the time, but that's what we're going to use today. And yes, we grow tons of parsley, but right now it's like this big in the greenhouse. So we'll get there. We'll get there. I do love the smell of parsley. I think it is actually my favorite herb, even though it's so ubiquitous. All right, let's see if we've forgotten any other ingredients. So we've got our red pepper flakes and our just ground black pepper, a little bit of extra virgin olive oil, and that's it. And then we'll give the whole thing a nice buzz. And then we'll bring our salad together. It's a really simple dish, but to me it's just like screams of springtime. All right, that's good. So olive oil. And I put a little bit of salt in the beginning, but I'm going to put a little bit more because that was really just for the garlic. So a little bit of salt, a little bit of black pepper, a little bit of red pepper. Okay, I think that's it. Let's close it up. Okay, now, this is really important. You should never serve anything to anybody without tasting it. And so this dressing, I'm going to taste it. And what I'm tasting it for are the following things: salt, fat content, acid. Is this starting to sound familiar? But not heat in this case. But yeah, we're basically trying to taste to see if it has enough salt, if it needs a little bit more olive oil, if it needs more lemon juice, and then adjusting it. And nothing is done until you do that. And one of the things that people often forget when they're tasting is acid. A lot of people will say, oh, that needs a little salt or a little bit of olive oil, but things really benefit from a little acid. It really heightens the profile, the flavor profile of many dishes. So we'll taste this. It's perfect, I would say. And the reason, so this particular dressing, you guys can see it maybe, it's pretty soupy. And that's because the grains will absorb so much of the dressing. And the reason, and this is also in the book, I like to make it basically ×2 so that I can use it on other things as well. because if you're going to go through, you know, the process of picking all the herbs and making a mess, you might as well make enough so you can use it for more than one dish. So this will easily dress this salad. And then tomorrow, if we want to eat this again with maybe a chicken breast or something else, the grains are going to dry out because they're going to be in the refrigerator, which is like a desert, and they're going to want more dressing. So we'll dress this until it looks right to us, and then we'll use the rest for eating this tomorrow or another dish or whatever we want. Okay. So now what we'll do is get a utensil. I'm going to add the asparagus to the farro. And the other thing we're going to add are some greens. And there's a wonderful farm right around here called Fine Line Farm, and they have the most beautiful spring salad greens. We also have beautiful salad greens, but theirs are quite a bit larger. I brought in our little tray of arugula to show you guys. All of our greens are about this size right now, and they're just a little bit too small to be cutting them. So I'm going to let them grow a little bit more before we start chopping them. But I will say, for those of you that don't grow microgreens, you can cut them back 3 times before they start to lose their delicious flavor. So it's kind of fun to grow a tray of greens and really easy to do inside in just potting soil. So here I have, I'm going to bring this to you in just a sec, these gorgeous greens. And this is a mix of many varieties of greens. We've got arugula, mizuna, beet greens, we've got mustard greens, Asian greens, pea shoots, all kinds of stuff. So this is perfect for the salad. Any mix of spring greens is great. So what I'm going to do here is spin the greens. I always, whenever greens come into the house, whether it's from the store or the garden, I always like to give them a really cold water bath and completely submerge them, press them underneath the water, lift them out of the water, pour out the water, put them in the salad spinner, and spin them dry, which oddly enough, I thought that was the only way to use a salad spinner. There's other ways. I've seen people do it in other ways, and that I would say is the best way to use it, because they get completely submerged. Okay, so it also sort of crisps them up, the nice cold water. So we've got these gorgeous greens. I'm going to move this aside. So we have our salad here. We've got the farro, we've got the arugula, and this is a lot of greens. So I'm going to put maybe, so green, right? It's beautiful. I love this dish. Some spinach is in here. We'll start with those since that's the size of our bowl. And I am somebody who likes to work with my hands, so we're going to do that today. It allows me to sort of have a more intimate relationship with the food and understand how much more dressing something needs or doesn't. So let me just sort of mentally do a checklist. We've got our buttermilk herb dressing, we've got our farro, we've got our asparagus, we've got our greens. I think that's it. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to pour a little bit of dressing onto here. And I'm going to put a little sea salt in here as well. And the reason I use sea salt at the end is because it has that lovely flaky texture, and it sort of is like an ingredient in the salad. It gives a little bit of crunch. It certainly gives some flavor. So now, great. So, okay, this very much looks like a salad to me. If you guys wanted this to feel more like substantial, you could increase the ratio of grain to green, and it could be something else for you. But this, I would say, would pair. You could eat this for lunch with an egg on top. You could pair it with roast chicken. It's got so many things in it that you wouldn't really need much else than maybe some sort of protein or bowl soup or something. I don't know. So anyway, that's the whole dish. What else? What else can I tell you? Hold on, let me wash my hands. Oh, I know what So we've started producing cooking videos here at Saltwater Farm, and we have a members club, and it's right on our website, and you can become a member and gain access to all of our online cooking classes, which I'm excited about. And if you haven't been to Maine or been to Saltwater Farm, it's hard to say when we'll be able to open our doors again to the public. But it's a really special place, and we have met so many incredible people over the past 10 years running the cooking school, people from all over the world. Some really talented home cooks have come through this kitchen, and it's so fun to cook alongside them. Yeah, it's a beautiful place, and maybe Kat, you can just give them a little view of the ocean here, because.
Do you want to go down to the greenhouse?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, we'll go for a quick. Let me grab my coat. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the table where we eat outside in summertime. And this is the greenhouse I was telling you about. So here we have all of our seedlings. There's probably 60 varieties of seeds in this. This is everything we'll need to plant the farm this year. It's pretty amazing. All of our seeds come from Johnny's and Fedco, which are both seed companies based in Maine. And it's really fun to sort of go through the catalogs in January when it's dreary and cold outside and look at all the beautiful tomatoes, which don't come up until August in Maine, or aren't ripe, I should say. But here they are now. Look at them. Look at our tomatoes. They're so cute. They haven't even gotten their true leaves yet, which is sort of the next phase for these guys. But we've got onions and cucumbers and zucchinis and lettuces and flowers and beans, and I mean, literally you name it. We grow just about everything here. There's, except for corn and potatoes. There's certain things that our soil won't tolerate. Or barely will tolerate. But what our soil loves here in Maine is berries and perennials, which is why Maine has the best blueberries. We grow some really interesting varieties of perennials here at Saltwater Farm, including goji berries, seaberry buckthorn, beach plums. We grow aronia, and these are all things that if you haven't heard of them before, I guarantee you will. It's just a matter of time because they're all really good for you. So if they don't have a place in the food market, they have a place in the health market. But I think that eventually they'll have a place in the food market too. My dad and I have a plan. So anyway, and I did want to just really quickly show you the asparagus. It's not much to see, but if for those of you that have never grown asparagus, you can take a little look at what they're doing. So this right here is like one asparagus plant, and you can see there's probably already like 10 little heads coming up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's 8. So it's pretty big, and these will grow so quickly in the summer or in the May and into June that you get like almost 10 new spears from each plant every other day. It's an astounding amount of asparagus. And it takes a while for the plants to get to this level of maturity and produce this many spears, but it's just awesome when they do. It takes about 4 or 5 months. But you know, you get a good crop the second, third year. So yeah, so that's the asparagus, and you can maybe spin around and take a quick look at the water. We go for a walk with every class down to the ocean to sort of break up the cooking, and we do some cooking down by the ocean. We've done a bunch of Argentine asados, which are really fun, where we take a whole lamb and cook it over fire, and we have a smoker down there, and Catherine, who's filming right now, catches fish and smokes them in the smokehouse. So it's really incredible to be living in this place, particularly right now, and having so much space. Yeah, so well, let's head back inside. Okay. All right. I read you guys. Are we okay? Okay. Just one quote that sort of summarizes my feelings on home cooking. Um, all right. So there is always another path to feeling satisfied and accomplished with the meal you lay down on the table. Indulge in your sense of culinary exploration and find comfort in the forgiving nature of home cooking. That is really what we try to leave people with here at Saltwater Farm. We want them to go home and feel more confident in their own kitchens, and that's what our cooking classes are all about. So, any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Annemarie. That looks like such a wonderful place to be at any time. I'm going to ask you a couple questions from the crowd, and then we'll add a few more on before we wrap up. So kind of going back to the beginning of your session, somebody's asking if that's how you would store the asparagus in the fridge, upright in a jar or cup in water.
Yeah, so we routinely have like 200 spears that need to be stored. And so we'll put them in some sort of shallow, flat vessel with water and then put them into the refrigerator. They do take up kind of a lot of space like that, but it is the way to sort of keep them the longest. They'll last for at least a week, if not, a week and a half, and still be really fresh that way. So yes, they need to be fed water like a flower. So.
Awesome. And do you do the same thing with herbs, or are there herbs that you might do that with? Or?
Glad you asked. So whenever you're storing herbs,
egg and vinegar. Have you ever done that one?
they're dry, and I usually put them into a Ziploc bag with a paper towel, and the paper towel absorbs any excess moisture from the herbs or lettuce or whatever vegetable you have. It's how I pack everything. I reuse all my Ziplocs, but the paper towel really helps so things don't get sort of slimy and too wet in the Ziploc and sort of sweat in a way. So I find that when you do that and you sort of get rid of all of the excess air in the Ziploc, herbs last a really long time and still look really beautiful. It makes a difference. Like I always insist that whoever is working here put everything away that way, because it makes all the food so much better.
Awesome. That's a great tip. And while we're on this track, would you do the same thing with lettuce, or do you have tips on how to keep lettuce?
Yeah, exactly the same. Lettuce is anything tender and green needs to be washed in cold water, bone dry, and then into a Ziploc with no air and a paper towel.
Awesome. Excellent. And somebody wanted to ask again what the brand of the mortar and pestle is that you were using.
It's called Milton Brook, based out of England, Miltonbrok.
Awesome.
Brook. I can't remember. Yeah, not a great speller.
We'll find it.
If you are going to buy one, make sure you get a size 4 or bigger. Anything less than a size 4 is not, it's hard to cook anything in something that small.
Awesome. And while we're talking about the mortar and pestle, Lou is wondering if you have a mortar and pestle reserved for your garlic, or if you use the same mortar and pestle for everything.
Because the surface of this one is so smooth, when you clean it, it doesn't smell like garlic. There's a lot of mortar and pestles that have a more coarse surface, and in that case, I would probably use those for different ingredients, but these guys are easy to clean, and you can get rid of whatever was in them completely.
Excellent. Great. And I want to ask you a couple of things while people are at home and I think filling their pantry. And this is sort of a silver lining of this time. I think people kind of getting more into and comfortable with home cooking. So my first question is, what what sort of inspired, you said you write recipes for a living, but you don't really use them. And what is the turning point at which you felt comfortable just sort of cooking, and what part did recipes play in that in the beginning, if at all? Aside from going to culinary school, of course, like what recommendations could you make for the home cook for just being sort of liberal with their culinary exploration at home?
Yeah. So I always say that the best tools you have as a cook are your instincts, and your senses, because you know more than you think you do. If something looks dry, it is. If it looks wet, it is. If it looks like, it's gonna burn, it's gonna burn. Like, a lot of people are like too quick to like look at the recipe and see what they did wrong instead of just do the thing they know that the food needs to save the day. And I think, like, in the cooking classes, we make a lot of mistakes on purpose. I'll make mistakes so people can see how to fix things, because that's the reality of cooking. And there's no way I was cooking without recipes, like 10 years ago. It took me at least 10 years of regular cooking, I would say, and professional cooking to feel totally confident cooking without recipes. But it's like the most freeing feeling in the world to just go to a market or go out into the garden and buy food without a plan. Not everybody does this, but I love, like, I have a lot of friends who are cooks up here, and the most fun thing about cooking is like the artistry of it and just being able to make good food out of whatever looks delicious, rather than like sticking to, a recipe that sort of mandates you do this, that, and that, a certain way. And I love being able to cook that way. And I especially salt, I feel like measuring salt is absurd. Like, salt is something you add and taste and add and taste. And if you taste all the way through cooking a dish, by the time it's done, it should be just right. So those are just like a few little things that come to mind when I think of not using recipes. It's not, I'd be lying if I said, like, anybody can make a cake without a recipe. Of course you can't. But after you've made 10 cakes, you have a pretty good sense of how a cake comes together. And now I like legitimately wing cake recipes, and they always come out because I've made enough cakes now. So it's a function of repetition, but it's also a function of just like freeing yourself. And the other thing that is noted in the book is there's a whole section called Keep It Simple. And one of the most amazing feelings as a cook is when I realized that simplifying food, recipes, and cooking makes better food. And a big part of that is honoring the ingredients that we have here in Maine. We have outstanding meat. We have outstanding vegetables and fish, my God. And so just cooking that really simply, seasoning it correctly, using like basic cooking techniques. I mean, that's what my book is all about. It's about just like the most basic approach to cooking, bringing out the best of what the food already has to offer, if it's good food. So.
Awesome. I love that. And that's sort of the essence of the Argentine asado. I love that you guys are doing that on the beach. Argentines are all about, like, you don't need to add a bunch of stuff, just get good food to start with. And there's two things that I love that you mentioned. And one is, if it looks the way it looks being an indicator. And if you're on a farm, so if your greens are rich green and they have a little purple in them or something, that likely it will taste good. And you mentioned farro, and you mentioned that we should all have these grains in our pantries. So could you give us like one or two grains if somebody's like, okay, I'm going to replace pasta with grains that might be good starter grains, maybe relatively easy? Maybe you mentioned them in your book.
So one of my new favorites is called frica. It's a North African grain. It's actually wheat that's harvested when it's still green. It has an amazing flavor. It doesn't take that long to cook it, which is part of why a lot of cooks like it, because some of these grains will take a while. So frica, I would say, is an awesome grain, and it's more readily available than certainly it was a few years ago. I love wheat berries. They're definitely a little bit, have more toothsomeness to them. It's a mouthful. They're a little firmer than a farro, but I really enjoy wheat berries. There's a recipe in my first book for grilled vegetables and wheat berries. Not so dissimilar from this, but more of like a August vegetable salad. So those are two you could keep in your pantry and try out. But really, the key with alternative grains, and I understand why people shy away from them. The way to cook them is the same way you cook pasta. Just think, you just like bring a big pot of salted water to a boil, throw the grain in. You can reference the package for cook time, but what you should be doing is tasting it at 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and you decide when it's done. You decide how much more salt it needs. And if you like that grain, awesome. Then cook it once a week. And if you don't buy it again. Try another one. So that's kind of like how I approached alternative grains. And now we eat them regularly. But it was, it's not like an easy, smooth transition for everybody, especially coming from an Italian family where we used to have pasta 4 nights a week. So.
Yeah, and I think that I learned a lot about grains because I forced myself to try it on its own, like you just said. I'm sort of like strange habit of not trying the food I'm cooking, although I'm getting better at it all the time. But like, well, you want to try the farro before you add that tasty dressing to it so you can get a better idea of what it actually tastes like. Okay, and one gardening question before I let you go from Trina in St. Augustine, who is planning to start a small raised container garden on the terrace and wondering if gardens at the beach have any challenges with such salty air.
Well, it's not necessarily the salty air. For us, it's actually the exposure. It's the winds that come off of the ocean that make growing hard for us. A happy garden, a happy vegetable garden, it likes a little bit of protection. And if you ever, if you're thinking about putting a garden on a roof terrace, like it's going to need a little bit of protection, whether that's in the form of, I don't know, like a little wall or maybe some potted plants. But for us, living near the ocean is like, a blessing in so many ways, but it definitely makes growing vegetables and annuals hard. The perennials love it. The beach plums, the raspberries, the aronia, the seaberry buckthorn, they love the ocean breeze and the salt air and like what the soil provides in Maine. But the soil here is sort of weak in nitrogen and phosphate, and so those are the kinds of things that annuals need. But if you're just making a raised bed, I would say make sure your soil, it is totally worth investing in the soil, whether that means getting a couple bags of compost, making your own compost and putting it in there, which takes time. And make sure that it's like if you don't have good soil, you don't have good food. So good soil, a little bit of protection from the wind, and you should be able to grow beautiful herbs, vegetables, all of that.
Excellent. And one final question to go back to your book. I'm curious what your favorite part of the book is and sort of why, whether it was writing that part or what you think is going to speak most to the people who take that book home with them.
Yeah. Well, it was like the year that I wrote this book was a really big year for me because I wrote this book while I was pregnant, and then delivered a baby. So like my favorite chapter is the September chapter because first of all, September is harvest time in Maine. It's just, this place is a fairy tale in September. We wait through like this long miserable winter, and then all of a sudden summer hits, and by September, like a lot of the tourists have gone back to, we love tourists, we want you to come back, but a lot of them, the kids go back to school, and this place is like all of a sudden sort of becomes ours again, and everything is so beautiful and sings of summer, and there's so much delicious food. So in September, right after my daughter was born, people would come to our house and bring by like buckets full of peaches and like so much produce and just absolutely gorgeous food. And I remember like sticking her in her little bassinet among a cornucopia of food, which was like, I was like, oh, it's my baby and all my delicious food. I was like in absolute heaven. Not to mention I had crazy hormones from having a child. But yeah, it was just, I'll never forget that time. And then the sleeplessness started and all of the rest of it. But yeah, it was just, so September is my favorite chapter. But one thing I love about this book and my first book, and I thank my publisher, Roost, for allowing me to do this, but the chapters of the book are the months of the year. And so I like literally sat down and wrote January and January, February and February. And for me, it's a much more authentic style of writing, and sort of modeled after one of my food loves, Nigel Slater, who's a British food writer. He does that as well. But yeah, just to be able to write in a moment and mean to your core everything that you say is like a privilege. So that's one of the things I love about the book.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Annemarie, for being with us here today. This was fantastic. For all of you listening, we'll send and watching, we'll send you a follow-up email with links to the book and to the Roost Bookshop and the Saltwater Farm Membership Club, which sounds pretty delightful. So we'll follow up with all of you and we'll send that recipe one more time. Enjoy your salads. And Annemarie, thank you so much for offering your time and energy to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank
All
you.
right.